Welcome to Human Monsters. Donald Henry Pee Wee Gaskins was born Donald Henry Parrott Jr. in Florence County, South Carolina on March 13th, 1933. His mother gave him her surname since she didn't know who his father was. They lived in poverty throughout his childhood. There was very little in the way of adult supervision. If his mother had been present at all times, she could have prevented him from drinking a can of kerosene when he was a year old, which caused him to suffer many health problems in the years to come. His mother believed that the kerosene caused many complications that were not solely manifested physically. Ultimately, she was determined to deflect any accountability for her moral failures as a parent. As far as the after effects of ingesting the kerosene, he had convulsions until he was 3 years old, had nightmares frequently throughout his childhood, and it is believed that it stunted his growth. Gaskins acquired the nickname Pee Wee, no doubt inspired by his diminutive stature, since he grew to a height of 5'5". As his mother neglected him, her boyfriends never shied away from visiting physical abuse upon Donald. His uncles would also participate. Commenting on this situation, Donald was quoted as saying, "When I was younger, there was always one or another of a bunch of different stepdaddies around. I called them all sir and never bothered to learn most of their names because I knew my mama wasn't married to them and they wouldn't likely be around for long." At one point, his mother married one of her paramours, though this didn't really bring much in the way of stability into their lives, just more physical abuse. Said Donald, "The one she finally did marry was one mean son of a bitch. He used to backhand me and knocked me clear across the room just for practice. But then everybody knocked me around. My uncles, my other stepdaddies." Donald didn't realize that Pee Wee wasn't his real name until he began serving time in reform school. It was there where he found out his real name was Donald. Both his nickname and his height attracted a great deal of bullying. As Donald recalled, "I never growed enough to keep up with the others. That's how I got the nickname. Pee Wee, Pee Wee, Pee Wee, playing with your pee-pee," they used to say. And when I got mad and hit somebody, that was all the excuse they needed to gang up and beat the hell out of me. When did the killer instinct arise in Donald Gaskins? There is a story from his childhood that indicates a point at which he arrived at a fork in the road of morality. His mother and stepfather took him to a carnival. One of the attractions was a tent containing many aquariums housing large and venomous snakes. Donald told the rest of the story. Then the barker stopped talking, took a live rat out of a box and dropped it in the cage with the snake. The rat ran around and around real fast. The cobra stirred and coiled, rose up and flared out its neck. And the rat stopped, froze like it thought if it stayed still it might turn invisible. What took hold of my attention right then was that the cobra's head was almost exactly as high up as my head when I looked through the glass. I was staring it right straight in the eye, and my reflection looked like that cobra and me had the same head and face and eyes. Ladies and gentlemen, the barkers started talking again. Most animals either kill for food or to defend themselves. A cobra eats twice a week. This one was fed last night. That bulge halfway down its length is the supper it is still digesting. So let me assure you, this snake is not hungry. And as you, no doubt, noticed when you walked up to its cage, the cobra didn't get upset. It just lays there. That's because it is used to people and knew it didn't need to defend itself. But now suddenly it has raised itself up and is about to strike. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what makes that cobra the most dangerous of all reptiles. The fact that even as we watch, it is preparing to kill for no reason other than the fact that it has decided to kill. The snake struck then, stretched out, and went back to sleep. The rat didn't move. I looked at my reflection, then at the cobra, and I turned and saw my girl cousin holding tight to my mama's leg. And I looked up at my mama's and stepdaddy's faces and saw that they seemed pretty scared too. I had a heart on, and I knew that what I just seen was somehow special and important, even though I didn't know why. The king cobra was a spirit animal of sorts for Donald Haskins, and one day Gaskins would emulate the monarch of the serpent world in his own way. Donald would experience abuse outside of his home, most of which occurred on the schoolyard. He described his experience with bullying. To me, school was more than just a waste. It was a kind of torture. Everybody picked on me. So I got into fights almost every day. And then I got punished by the teachers and principal for fighting. It's no wonder I never learned jack shit. My stepdaddy said if I weren't going to school, I had to work in the fields and do more chores. I said I wanted to work on cars, not on a farm. But he beat my ass so hard every time I slipped off to work for the mechanic that I decided it was best just to do whatever he wanted. Donald developed a knack for mendacity while dealing with his abusive stepfather. By lying to him, he could avoid the beatings. Dishonesty was a means of survival, and he would find other practical uses for it in the years to come. Donald Gaskins' career in malfeasance began at the age of 11, which was when he dropped out of school. He got together with two friends who shared his criminal aspirations, and they called themselves the Trouble Trio. They specialized primarily in petty crimes at first, though they would eventually advance to burglary and gambling. Gaskins' sexuality merged with his criminal activities. He and the other members of the Trouble Trio spent much of their disposable income on prostitutes. They also raped a number of boys who lived in the area. The trio would threaten to carry out even more heinous attacks on their victims were they to report the incidents to their parents or police. As a result, Donald Gaskins established quite a reputation. As former Sheriff William Barnes put it, they were all scared of him in the lower county. Gaskins may have victimized many boys, but he was still imbued with misogyny and a drive to inflict violence upon females. As he put it, even back then, girls pissed me off. It especially made me mad that them bitches could do anything they wanted. Show their asses, make fun of me, even beat me up, and dare me to do anything about it, knowing I couldn't do nothing without being punished by grown-ups. The law caught up with Donald Gaskins when he broke into a home one day and encountered a female resident. She attacked him with an axe. He managed to wrestle it out of her hands and inflicted some head wounds before fleeing the scene. What he likely didn't expect was that she would crawl to a nearby stream where she was eventually discovered still alive. She probably looked like E.T. when they found him in the forest by then, but she survived. She reported him to the police as she recovered. Gaskins was convicted of attempted murder and was sentenced to incarceration at reform school until the age of 18. The South Carolina Industrial School for Boys proved to be the school of hard knocks for Pee Wee Gaskins. He was beaten and gang-raped routinely. As his daughter put it, he was a tiny, tiny person, and, the bigger boys heaped on him. Donald's survival strategy was to sexually service a guy who was known in the cell block as Boss Boy. He received some amount of protection from Boss Boy, but the gang rapes hadn't petered out entirely. As Pee Wee noted, he liked to watch gang rapes with me on the bottom. Pee Wee would escape from the facility several times throughout his 4-year stay. Between the sexual abuse and mistreatment at the hands of the correctional officers, he was dying to get out. The first time he escaped, a police officer checked out an abandoned house which he knew had been in use by Gaskins from time to time, especially while he was on the lam. Gaskins was taken into custody and brought back to the reform school. As punishment for running away, he received 30 lashes and a month of hard labor. His second escape was foiled when police used bloodhounds to track him down. He was not as easy to find this time around, as he sought refuge in the forest and swamps, an area with which he was very familiar since childhood, since it provided a solace to which he could escape from abuse. As punishment for his second escape, he was harshly beaten and sentenced to 4 months of hard labor. The third time he escaped, his family reported him to the authorities, and he was brought back to the reformatory for more severe punishments. The fourth time Donald Gaskins escaped from the reformatory, he became employed by a traveling carnival. This time, the law would not catch up with him so quickly. During his time working for the carnival, he met a 13-year-old girl that he would marry one day. 1950. Donald Gaskins was released back into society. His release report did not bode well for his future. It said Gaskins was, quote, antisocial, and there is something in his past development that is preying upon his mind. We consider him dangerous and also believe that he has the homicidal tendencies peculiar to a paranoid type. When Donald returned to Florence County, he was a more highly skilled and knowledgeable criminal with the bloodlust of a predator. He graduated magna cum laude from Conn College, and he was eager to profit from what he had learned. Donald Gaskins' first legitimate job after his release was working as a farmhand in the tobacco fields. He would pilfer tobacco and sell it on the open market. He was also paid by farmers to burn down their barns as part of an insurance fraud scheme. A year after his release, Pee Wee assaulted one of the tobacco farmer's daughters. She asked him why he was burning her father's barn down. She also laughed at him. He was sick and tired of the mockery. A perfect storm of fear of arrest, misogyny, and a general fondness for violence drove him to attack the girl with a hammer. She survived the attack, and Gaskins wound up in a men's prison in Columbia, South Carolina, after being convicted of attempted murder. It was in prison where Donald Gaskins would graduate to homicide. There were men known as power men in the institution, and he ingratiated and became subservient to one named Hazel Brazel. One day, Gaskins was bringing Brazel some food. What Brazel was unaware of was that Gaskins was about to serve it with a side order of paring knife. Brazel was on the toilet and therefore vulnerable at the time. Gaskins slit his throat while Brazel was distracted. Brazel bled to death on the floor of the cell. Gaskins was charged with the murder, though he was able to bring the charge down to manslaughter through a plea bargain. He served that sentence concurrently with the time he was already doing. Gaskins achieved a new status due to his murder of Hazel Brazel. Not only did everyone leave him alone, but he joined the ranks of the power men. As he noted, "I wouldn't never again have to be afraid of anybody in the pen, no matter how long I was there." Being 5'5" tall, he needed a reputation as someone who was not to be fucked with, and the murder of a power man served him well in that regard. Describing the after effects, Gaskins said, "I could get pretty much anything I needed. I had the system working for me. I had power, and my weapon, and all the young meat I wanted." Gaskins spent most of the 1950s and 60s in prison, except for some escapes he managed to pull off. During one of those escapes, he rejoined the carnival with which he was previously employed. He met a woman there again and married her, though he left her after only 2 weeks. To say Pee Wee Gaskins was a recidivist would be an understatement. A year after being paroled in 1961, he was charged with the statutory rape of a 12-year-old girl. He served time in prison for that conviction until 1968. When he was released that year, he vowed to himself that he would never see the inside of a prison again. It is believed that Donald Gaskins' first murder outside of prison occurred near Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. He pulled over to the side of the road where a young woman was thumbing a ride. He propositioned her for sex. She declined rather harshly. Pee Wee didn't like that. He didn't like that one bit. The fires of entitlement burst forth from idling embers into a raging inferno, and he beat the woman unconscious. Following this, he raped, tortured, and murdered her. He disposed of her body in a swamp, where it sank to the bottom. This experience was revelatory to him, as he explained, and the answer was simple. What I had to do was kill her. I remember smiling to myself and wondering why I hadn't ever thought of that before. If she was dead, She couldn't tell the law or nobody nothing. So once I had made up my mind and decided that she was going to die anyhow, I could do anything I wanted with her. He killed many people in that area of the country. He described his methods. Some of them I cut, some I burned. I ran a cable in and out one and hung her up by it. I pumped another full of water, which seemed to really hurt, filling her up until it came out of her nose and mouth, but she died quick, which I hadn't expected, so I didn't do that anymore. I preferred for them to last as long as possible. He found much of his inspiration for torture in hardware stores. Hammers, saws, ice picks, and other tools for repairs and renovations were used by him to deconstruct human beings. One day in 1974, he picked up two hitchhikers that appeared to be young women due to their long hair. He discovered, to his dismay, that they were both men. He didn't discriminate when it came to rape and murder, however, and he subjected both men to sexual assault and other barbaric tortures before killing them. He cut their bodies into pieces and tossed them all into a swamp. Gaskins claimed he would make his victims watch as he ate parts of their bodies. On occasion, they would be forced by him to eat parts of their own bodies. As far as this latter behavior was concerned, his daughter described his mentality on those occasions. He would get this urge that he would have to see blood. He called himself a vampire. Gaskins' own reflection. By October of 70, I had picked up and coastal killed 10 girls total, including the 3 done in 69. But the most important thing about 1970 was that it was the year I started doing my serious murders. Though Donald Gaskins enjoyed killing as a hobby of sorts, he also did it for financial gain. Some homicides came as conclusions to robberies. Others were carried out as contract killings. Others were killed for fear that they would report him to police, which had happened before. Dennis Bellamy, 25 years old, and his 15-year-old brother, Johnny Knight, made the unfortunate decision to collaborate with Donald Gaskins on an auto theft ring. Donald set up a meeting with them in a forest close to his home in rural Florence County. There they were to discuss their business plan in more detail. Pee-wee didn't trust them. He was concerned that they would report him to police. Once Dennis and Johnny arrived, Donald pointed to a tree limb that was located very highly up. He noted that it could be used to hoist stolen cars. While the men were taking this in, Donald shot one of them in the back of his head. When the other ran off, he shot him. Gaskins had created a communal burial site, and that is where he buried both of their bodies. Commenting on his possible motive, Gaskins' daughter said, "If he thinked they were gonna, they were getting tired or they were gonna tell on him, then he'd get rid of them." Somehow, word got around that Pee-wee Gaskins was available as a hired gun. One Suzanne Kipper was a jilted lover who was keen to see her ex-boyfriend, Silas Yates, disappear. She paid Pee-wee $1,500 for the hit, approximately $8,724. He had three accomplices who helped him dispose of the body. One of them was Diane Neely. She and her boyfriend, Avery Howard, called Pee Wee and threatened to turn him into the authorities unless he paid them $5,000. He promised them that he would pay them the money. When Neely and Howard went to meet up with Gaskins in a neutral location, it was the last time anybody saw them alive. Donald Gaskins categorized his murders into two classifications. The weekend murders were done for recreation. The murders he committed during the week were mostly for business, like the contract killings. Eventually, anybody he came into contact with was a potential victim. He was a killer at heart, and the ways in which murder empowered him became addictive. Some part of Gaskins must have wanted to get caught. He bought a hearse and inscribed the phrase, "I hold dead bodies," on it. It didn't scare anybody. People just thought he was eccentric. Starting in 1970, Gaskins' choice of victim changed markedly. He no longer just killed criminals, drifters, and people he had robbed. Acquaintances, friends, and relatives also wound up being killed by him. They didn't have to do much to trigger his wrath. Whether they asked him for a favor or even just stopped by for an unexpected visit, everyone was a potential corpse in his eyes. In November of that year, his niece, 15-year-old Janice Kirby, and her friend, Patricia Alsobrook, were walking home when Pee Wee happened to drive along. He offered them a ride. The destination proved to be an abandoned house, where he raped, tortured, and killed them both. He launched an attack on a family friend named Doreen Dempsey, 23 years old. She was about to move to another state with her 2-year-old child in tow. The problem was she needed a ride to the bus terminal from rural South Carolina. Enter Pee Wee Gaskins. Doreen and her daughter never made it to the bus station. Pee Wee brought them to a swamp where he raped and killed Doreen. The child was not spared. To quote his daughter, he said he could not resist raping the baby. Another one of his victims was 20-year-old Martha Dix. She hung around his repair shop, and he put up with some of her teasing, despite the fact that he was racist and she was black. Ultimately, her jokes went a little too far. Whether it was a joke or not, she started telling people that she was pregnant with Pee Wee's child in 1971. He invited her to the shop one night for drinks. Hers was spiked with a fatal dose of sedatives. Once she perished, he dumped her body in a ditch. He said his motive for killing her was punishment for her, quote, lying mouth. Donald Gaskins' daughter, Shirley, played a role in many of his murders. She would invite a friend or a cousin over to their home. After serving them a meal, Pee Wee would lure her guest away and kill them. Kim Gaskins, 13 years old, rejected Pee Wee's sexual overtures. This Gaskins would not abide, and he kidnapped, raped, and murdered her. He buried her in the swamp. Unlike many other of Gaskins' victims, the Kim Gaskins case attracted a great deal of attention throughout the community, most likely because of her age. Due to his strange behavior and seedy persona, Donald Gaskins became a prime suspect. A warrant was issued for his home. Clothing that had belonged to Kim Gaskins was found on the property. Gaskins was arrested for contributing to the delinquency of a minor. 1975 marked the apex of Donald Gaskins' homicidal activity. One day he spotted a van on the side of the road. It had broken down. The 3 passengers were 2 males and a female. Normally, he was more prepared, but this was the kind of opportunity that didn't arise very often, and, seeing Florence County as his web, he had an arachnid's instinct for prey. He passed himself off as a good Samaritan before he went to work on them. He handcuffed all 3 and subjected them to horrific tortures before killing them and drowning them all in a swamp. They all begged for mercy before he dispatched them to their watery graves. But he was a stranger to mercy. Commenting on these murders, Gaskins said, "It's hard to say which one suffered the most. I tried to make it equal." He didn't feel the same satisfaction after this killing, for there was a problem that urgently needed to be addressed in order to ensure he would remain a free man. The van. Of this he said, "It was sure to get found, which was sure to bring the law, who was sure to ask questions all up and down the highway." He was in a jam for sure, and he needed help. He decided to elicit assistance from one of his criminal associates that he met in prison. He contacted a man named Walter Neely. Neely drove the van to Gaskins' repair shop, where Pee-wee repainted and refurbished it. His intention was to sell the van so he could profit from the murder monetarily. Once the most time-consuming and labor-intensive aspects of the operation were behind them, Gaskins told Neely everything about the murder. He told him about all his murders, actually, and did so with pride, as if he were describing championship athletic feats. Eventually, he would show Neely the sites where he dumped bodies. On one occasion, 2 people who had stolen from Pee-wee were killed by him, and Neely helped him dispose of the corpses. As investigators were on the case to ascertain who killed Kim Gaskins, they began to lean on Donald Gaskins' friends and relatives. At one point, Walter Neely was interrogated, and he folded under scrutiny. He not only told them that Gaskins confessed to him to having committed murders, but Neely even showed the detectives where he and Pee-wee buried bodies together. Reflecting on this, Gaskins realized that disclosing his history with homicide, even to another criminal, was a foolhardy pursuit. As Gaskins said of the criminals he knew in prison, "The time I spent with them was my college education. Since then, every time I have been faced with a problem or a choice, I have thought back to the things that they said to me. And whenever I followed their advice, I always came out okay. It was the times I didn't do as they advised that I found myself in deep shit." Ian Parnell Jr. was one of the state investigators who went to the wooded area to unearth the bodies that were left there by Donald Gaskins. Describing the operation, he said, "We just lined up and started walking slowly into the woods. Sometime during that process, in moving through the bushes and undergrowth, somebody discovered that there were some bushes that had been put there that weren't growing there. This represented the first of the 6 bodies that would be found in that area. Even for the most experienced of the officers, it was a shocking display. As one of them remarked, "Yeah, it was a pretty gruesome scene. I guess I was overwhelmed. I had been in law enforcement for some 12 and a half years prior to this, and I'd never seen anything of that magnitude." As the dig was underway, Parnell commented on the stench of decay. "I've never been a smoker, but the smell of decaying flesh was so intense in that area that, the smoke from the cigars diminished that smell enough to where you could stand it." All the bodies were buried in pairs. April 27th, 1976. Both Donald Gaskins and Walter Neely were charged with 8 counts of murder. Gaskins' first conviction was for the murder of Dennis Bellamy on May 24th, 1976. He was sentenced to death. He agreed to plead guilty to 7 more murders under the proviso that he would not receive the death penalty. In November that year, the Supreme Court in South Carolina ruled that the death penalty was unconstitutional, so he was spared after all. Gaskins enjoyed his stay in prison this time around. Everybody knew who he was and his reputation as a cold-blooded killer who would not tolerate disrespect and had even killed for money put him in good standing. Anybody who did not possess the same killer instinct gave him a wide berth, and the power men respected him for being a badass. The decision to criminalize the death penalty was overturned in 1978, so now Pee Wee Gaskins was once again a candidate for Old Sparky after all. 1982. Donald Gaskins may have been sentenced to death, but his career as a contract killer was alive and well. Thriving, even. One thing that doesn't thrive in this day and age is the term mildly retarded. You could get canceled for using that vernacular. But the early 80s was a different time. So different that people used the term mildly retarded openly. Even medical professionals used it in a clinical setting, and not within the framework of slang. In the prison where Donald Gaskins was doing time, a man named Rudolph Tyner ate the same insipid slop for dinner as Pee Wee Gaskins. He was referred to as mildly retarded by his own attorney, so he wasn't faring well with his fellow man by that point. One of the key differences between him and Pee Wee Gaskins was their IQs. Rudolph Tyner's IQ was congruent with the speed limit of a residential district, numerically speaking. One thing they did have in common was that they were on death row for committing murders, 2 in Tyner's case. He killed an elderly couple named William and Myrtle Moon. They owned a convenience store that was robbed by Tyner. Once he collected all the money from the till, he killed the Moons. The Moons had an adopted son named Tony Chimo, and he was frustrated by the appeals process that was keeping Tyner in the pink, so he could continue being mildly retarded indefinitely. Tony could not abide the fact that his parents suffered and died for nothing, while Rudolph enjoyed whatever limited pleasures there were to be had by a death row inmate who was mildly retarded. He decided to get Donald Gaskins to wipe him out. Shirley Gaskins described how the transaction came about. Tony was friends with someone in prison, and they got Daddy and Tony together. That someone's name was Jack Martin. The very first person he recommended for the hit was Donald Gaskins. From Gaskins' viewpoint, this happened at the right time. The prison in which he was incarcerated was almost hermetically sealed, guaranteeing that Gaskins would never be able to escape. Aggression had been building up inside of him, and he needed to let off some steam. Torture and murder would offer the perfect release, as Gaskins put it. Because all this happened at the time I just described, when I wasn't making no headway with my own escape plans, and was feeling even downer than usual. I took it as a personal challenge. Besides, I figured there weren't nobody in CCI I couldn't get to if I wanted, and it seems to me this Tyner truly did deserve to die. He may have felt that Tyner deserved to die, but his true motivation for committing the murder was financial gain. Mind you, the fact that Tyner was black was another motivating factor. Due to his fearsome reputation, Gaskins was in a privileged position in terms of his freedom to roam from cell block to cell block. He befriended Rudolph Tyner, bringing him gifts on a regular basis. Due to his low intelligence, Tyner was not worldly enough to realize that if someone brings you presents in prison, there would have to be an ulterior motive. The items Gaskins gave Tyner were bait. Eventually, the time would come when the snake would seize upon the rat. Gaskins decided to use poison to kill Tyner. As Pee-wee reported to Chimo, "We gave that son of a bitch all of it. But one dose, and all it's doing is making that son of a bitch sick. We'd put it in some damn buck for him to drink the other night. And he drank, and two more drank, and all it was made all three of them sick as hell. The poison made Tyner sick, but the effects were not fatal." Gaskins had to turn up the heat. He was assigned the position of prison maintenance man. He was issued a number of tools, many of which he kept in his cell. He soon moved into the cell adjacent to Rudolph Tyner's. He somehow devised a crude telephonic device with which he and Tyner could communicate. Demonstrating he was better with tools than with words, Gaskins said to Chimo, "I came up with someone. You can't be no damn making sick on it. I need one electric cap and as much of a stick of damn dynamite as you can get." Chimo was not able to smuggle a stick of dynamite into the prison, but he managed to traffic a minute amount of C4 plastic explosives. In order to get it back to his cell, Gaskins carried it in a secret compartment he cut into the heel of one of his work boots. Pee-wee took a state-issued drinking cup and used it to seal the blasting cap, explosives, and wires. He gave it to Tyner, explaining that it was to be used as a receiver for the phone he made. If you were mildly retarded, you wouldn't question it. As Gaskins explained to Chimo, "I'll take a damned radio and rig it into a bomb, and when he plugs that son of a bitch up, it will blow him into hell." Donald Gaskins was no slouch when it came to methods of mayhem. When Rudolph Tyner put the so-called receiver to his head, he was blown up and died instantaneously. As Tyner's lawyer put it, "Pieces of him were blown all over the prison. Fingers were everywhere." Donald Gaskins and Tony Chimo discussed the details of the murder plot in recordings made with audio cassettes. Though they communicated in code, the recordings were used as evidence to implicate them both in the conspiracy. Chimo was sentenced to 8 years, but was released after serving 6 months. A TV movie about the incident aired in 1986 called Vengeance, the Story of Tony Chimo. Gaskins was charged with capital murder. Now there would be no obstructions in securing the death penalty for the man who would become known as the meanest man in America. Around the world, true crime buffs, like you, became intrigued by this pint-sized monster. The state of South Carolina used its taxpayers' dollars to pay for two of the most capable defense lawyers on the publicly subsidized payroll, John Young and Jack Swerling. When they first met Donald Gaskins in prison, John Young insisted that staff remove Gaskins' handcuffs. The response to this from Gaskins was curious. He said, "Yous ain't afraid of Pee-wee?" It appeared that John Young earned Gaskins' respect at one point, for Pee-wee said, "I hate all lawyers except you." The respect was not reciprocated, though Young was too shrewd to make this obvious. After all, a client can fire their attorney at any time and for any reason. Expressing his true feelings about Gaskins sometime later, Young said, "He was the most evil human being, if you could call him human, that I've ever known." In 1983, despite the best efforts of John Young and Jack Swerling, the prosecution buried their arguments with incriminating and irrefutable evidence. Donald Henry Gaskins was convicted of capital murder. He was sentenced to death as predicted. During his time in prison, Gaskins collaborated with author Wilton Earl on a book called Final Truth, the autobiography of mass murderer, serial killer Donald Pee-wee Gaskins. September 6, 1991. Gaskins was scheduled for an execution for this date, but he decided to steer his own ship and commit suicide. He slit his wrists, but he did not bleed out to his satisfaction. He received stitches and was escorted to the electric chair as scheduled. Gaskins' thoughts on death. "I truly don't mind dying. I've lived a damned full and good life, and I don't believe there is much to death anyhow, except peaceful darkness. I am one of the few that truly understands what death and pain are all about. I have walked the same path as God. By taking lives and making others afraid of me, I become God's equal. Through killing others, I become my own master. Through my own power, I come to my own redemption. When they put me to death, I'll die remembering the freedom and pleasure of my life. I'll die knowing that there are others coming along to take my place, and that most of them will never get caught." Sadly, the loved ones of his victims would not enjoy the peace and closure that were endemic to Donald Gaskins' execution. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.